Obviously, I'm not Richard Sennett. You hopefully got the email I sent out yesterday. He's been in the hospital this semester, and I was in touch with him every few weeks, and he would say he'd try to be in touch with me when his health was restored, but it seems that hasn't happened because I haven't heard from him in a little while. So he is unfortunately not able to be here tonight. So we are just going to wrap up the Craftsman and prepare for kind of this is a turning point in the class. Starting next week, the faculty guest presenters start to come in from here through the end of the semester. So we'll look at what how Sennett could have possibly helped us to prepare for all of the subsequent presentations. Just a couple announcements. Hopefully I mentioned this in the email I sent out yesterday, which was primarily about Sennett's non-appearance, but I've also posted it as an announcement on Blackboard. Kit Laybourne, who's our first guest presenter next week, has changed his reading assignment. He decided he wanted to cut down on the amount of reading he was asking you to do in advance. So instead of all the links, and he asked you to look at McLuhan's probes and watch a video, I mean, it won't be a waste of your time if you've already done those things. Because they're obviously, he's an important figure in the field, but instead he's created a PDF collapsing a lot of the websites that he's created for his classes. So I've posted that to the resources section of Blackboard. And he's also asked you to fill out what he calls media chops is one of his websites. He's asked you to fill out an inventory about your media use, production skills, and media consumption habits, which is part of his own area of research and some of the work he does in his courses. And he's asked in particular that you try to fill that out. It's relatively short. It should maybe take you 5 minutes to do. It's an online survey. It's a lot of filling in dots on a Likert scale and then maybe typing some comments. He's asked that you do that by this Wednesday, by the end of the day, because he and his TA are then going to tabulate all the results. So we actually have some data to try to make sense of, so that you and your TAs can talk about what meaningful conclusions we can come to from this data in your discussion sections next week. For this week, as you might have noticed in the syllabus, there is no discussion section. We're giving you time to work on your abstracts, which are due next week, and I am planning to take a couple minutes right after I'm done with these announcements to ask if you have any questions about that assignment. But before I do so, I also discovered from several of the TAs and from some emails I received from students that a few of you, or actually quite a few of you, had questions about what constitutes a scholarly source. Obviously, research doesn't have to be limited only to scholarly sources. You can cite the popular press, you can cite blogs, you can cite discussion groups. All of that has its place if it's contextualized and you address kind of the potential credibility of these sites. But just for the purpose of this exercise, we really want you to learn how to work with different forms of scholarly publication. So there is some debate over what constitutes a scholarly source. It's not really a cut and dried definition. There aren't 5 criteria you have to meet. But I did find a couple resources online, several scholarly articles talking about what constitutes a scholarly source. And they identified a few things that do tend to distinguish scholarly publications from popular publications and other forms of writing. So I will just go through some of those quickly. I know that Barbara copied me on a very helpful sheet she sent out to her sections identifying some criteria, one of which, a very common defining characteristic, is peer review, which essentially means that when you as an academic, an author submitting a piece to a journal or to a book publisher, your work has to be reviewed, typically anonymously, by peers in your field. They don't want to know who you are because they don't want the fact that you are Richard Sennett or Marshall McLuhan or some other big name to color their perception and possibly smooth over any gaps in your logic or any methodological flaws. So you submit your work anonymously. You don't typically know who your reviewers are, but that peer review really helps to confirm or ensure that your work meets the standards in your field. And the way you can find out if something is peer-reviewed is most academic presses, particularly the book divisions, are just by default. But if you look at a website for a journal, if you're not sure, for instance, if a cinema journal is peer-reviewed or not, if you find the website, I think that's published at the University of Texas, typically there is a link for it commonly is called for authors or submissions. And you look there and it often tells you what the review process is, how many rounds of review it goes through, the fact that it'll go through an anonymous review board. It might sound, it's typically quite easy to find on the website, but if you have any questions, if you found a journal that looks scholarly, but you're not sure about what process an author would go through to get something reviewed and accepted for publication, you'll usually find that information on the website. And then if you do have any questions, that's where your TAs and I can help to fill in. Another common criterion is that it is published by an academic press. The University of Minnesota Press, University of Chicago Press, MIT Press has a lot of journals, University of Texas, I think does Cinema Journal, and the Velvet Light Trap, which is a cinema and screen studies journal for graduate studies, edited by graduate students. So those are just some common journals. If it typically has university in the title, you know it's a scholarly press, and you can bet 98% probably that it is going to be a peer-reviewed process. A couple other criterion is that they're kind of almost common sense, that the purpose of an academic or a scholarly publication is that it's contributing to research within the field. It has to be disseminated to the field at large. It's usually announced to the field that you are making a new contribution to the literature or to the knowledge in the field. It has to be publicly accessible. That doesn't necessarily mean available in full text through a Google search. What it usually means is that it's available through one of the databases that Paul Abruzzo showed us a couple weeks ago. He mentioned, he pulled down that subject list and showed you some of the common resources in the Communication and Media Studies list, like the EBESCO sites, EBESCO, I think is the acronym. Also, there are several sites in the humanities resources. I really like JSTOR and Project Muse. I don't know if any of you have used those. They're often full-text PDFs of resources as well. Those are almost always peer-reviewed academic publications. And for books, just look at the copyright page, see who published it. If it's an academic press, it's probably a scholarly publication. So those are just some criteria you can use to decide. And that will, in turn, help you to decide what you want to do your abstracts on. We talked about this 2 weeks ago. I did a brief overview of it in the lecture, and then hopefully your discussion section exercise on abstracting helped you to get a better sense of the purpose and the process of abstracting. But just remember that we do want you to do one abstract of an academic book, and then 2 one-page abstracts of articles. So it's 1 2-page abstract of a book, 2 1-page abstracts of an article. That's all in the syllabus, because I realize those numbers might get conflated. But does anybody have any questions about abstracting or the purpose of the assignment, or where you can find some recommendations for the format? We tried to put all this up in the lessons maybe 2 weeks ago, but I just want to see if there are any remaining questions, because this is really all you have to do between now and next week is work on your abstracts. Are there any questions? Some people wrote me with a few and asked that I bring it up in class today. Nobody. We'll give you 10 seconds. You can think about if you have any questions or not. Yes? I don't have that with me right now in this presentation, but if you download the PowerPoint from October 6th, it is the 6 questions. That's not the be-all, end-all format. That's not the universal format for an abstract, but that's one that in consulting maybe 10 different sources, I collectively put that together. It's pulling on questions that several different abstracting resources, research methods, textbooks put together. It's really a combination of a lot of different sources. It's also in I know we have some other hands there, it's also in the navigating, actually I'll show you where it is, if I can get to the course website. This might take too long. So if you just go into resources, it is in supplemental materials for week 4, I think it is. It's the navigating research text. Actually, because you might not have seen that, I think I will actually go to the trouble of showing you where to find it. Sorry, it's so slow here. So here's our lecture site. If you go into resources, it's under week 4, supplemental reading. And this is the document that I drew a lot of the lecture material from. It's something I created when I taught our old research methods class. So not only are there the 6 questions we recommend that you ask, but there are some tips about reading efficiently. I've added a couple extra tips. This is just over the weekend actually about external or secondary or tertiary resources that are really helpful for reading theory. So this might be a good reference document for you to keep if you ever find that you're having trouble with reading research reports or dense theoretical types of writing. But the abstracting is all outlined here as well. Any other questions? Uh-huh. That's really up to you. I think maybe for the purposes of this first attempt at it, it might help for you and help for your TAs to make sure you're actually covering all the bases, to just maybe number or provide some type of a cue in the text so they can see where you believe you're launching into the critique or where you believe you're addressing methodology. But this is something that as I first started writing these, I went through and had essentially 6 parts to my document and numbered them. But then I realized that it actually made more sense for me to figure out how they all fit together. So I started to have more of a flow between them. There was actually a narrative form. So it's something, I'm sure the form of your abstracts will evolve. But for this first attempt, it might be easy for you and your TAs if you just try to stick with those 6 sections so you know when you're addressing particular questions and so your TAs know as well. Mm-hmm. One book and 2 academic journal articles. Yep. Yes.
When you actually say journal article, is it okay if it's an essay from like an anthology or something that may not necessarily have been in a journal, but is published like in, a text, but is of shorter length?
Yes, I think that's okay, right? Because there are a lot of journal articles that are then republished as part of anthologies or compendiums or compendia, so that should be okay. Anything else? We can take more questions at the end if you think of anything between now and then, and we're always on email too. I probably shouldn't say that because it opens up all kinds of doors, but now we'll go back to this. Okay, I think that's all of the announcements I had. Last week, we obviously weren't here, and skip through that, but hopefully you had a chance to read the lecture I put together, which was about the sections of the Craftsman that were really about material consciousness. And there are many different ways to think about how those words fit together, what material consciousness means. And I'm going to try to go through them quickly by drawing on several images from the Fletcher book, which really actually pretty nicely illustrate some of what Sennett was talking about. One way is to think about being conscious in the most literal sense of how we hold or use our tools, which I'm not sure if they actually teach penmanship in elementary school anymore, but the appropriate angle at which to hold a pen, I don't know if any of you had typing in middle school. I did. We actually had the teacher coming around and pulling up our wrists to make sure they were up. So there was a proper hand form for typing. Your piano teachers probably did the same thing. If you took violin lessons in the Suzuki method, you had that tape on your fingerboard, and the teacher made sure that you had your fingers in the appropriate place. So this is just being conscious of how you're using your material tools. This is one level of thinking about material consciousness. But you might remember from a few weeks ago when we were talking about Marx's definition of labor or craft, that it's not only about, he doesn't think of material only in kind of a physical form, that we can give form to things in symbolic ways as well. So it's being conscious of kind of a symbolic form of consciousness. And so it's not only the physical tools that he's talking about, it's also, as this Fletcher image illustrates, this is a way fishermen, I believe, use nets made knots in their fishing nets to essentially recreate a map. There are lots of other South American peoples who used very similar looking stringed pieces that almost look like decoration that were called kipu, which were also a form of record keeping or accounting or way of writing stories through knotting of strings and attaching beads to strings. So this also is obviously a physical representation of consciousness. It's a very material way of representing thought. So that's another level on which we might think of material consciousness. The online students also wrote me the past few weeks to make sure I actually announce the slide numbers so they can follow along. So it might seem superfluous to you, but I'm actually going to try to remember to say which slide number we're on. So this is slide number 4, the knotted fishing net. This is a quotation from Marx and Fletcher on slide 5. In 1867, Karl Marx made much of the 500 different kinds of hammer produced in Birmingham, each adapted to fulfill a specific task. He also neatly defined machines as knowledge objectified. That's really a very convenient synonym for material consciousness, in a way. Machines had become an extension of man. That should sound familiar to you if you've read McLuhan. That's the subtitle of his book, Understanding Media. Machines had become an extension of man. Previously, we shaped tools. Thereafter, they shaped us. A profound change which meant that instead of wondering how to breed a better horse, there were those, like Henry Ford, imagining a world without the horse. So this doesn't necessarily have to be a deterministic relationship. It's not that television makes us, or video games make us violent people, or texting increases the strength of our thumbs, which might be the case. So it's not a causal relationship. This shaping doesn't have to go into the realm of technological determinism, which is a claim or a critique some people offer of this way of thinking. But it really is shaping more symbolic things as well, shaping consciousness in a very symbolic way of thinking of the word. This is a quotation from Sennett that also gets at what he means by material consciousness. The enlightened way to use a machine is to judge its powers, fashion its uses, in light of our own limits, rather than the machine's potential. We should not compete against the machine. Against the claim of perfection, we can assert our own individuality. So rather than going to an Avid station or using Pro Tools and allowing that to determine the extent of our possibility, we should come with a clear notion of what we want to do with a project, take from that machine what we can get from it, or that tool or that method, and then maybe combine methodologies so we can realize the fullness of our vision without allowing our plans or our vision to be prescribed by what the machine lets us do. That's something that maybe by fashioning courses that are defined by the very specific platform you're using can promote that very limited form of consciousness where the realm of possibility is limited by what the platform allows you to do, rather than you coming with a fully formed vision or even a rudimentary vision and allowing that machine to help you in whatever ways it can, and then combining that with other things to take it even further. Sennett also talks a lot about play. They had a few sections of a chapter about play, which is really experimenting with what different platforms, techniques, technologies allow you to do. I've drawn several times over the past few classes on an architect. I'm blanking on his first name. Michael, I believe it is, his book Abstracting Craft. His argument really is a nice parallel to Sennett's. He writes, as a verb, to craft seemingly means to participate skillfully in some small-scale process. It suggests that partnerships with technology, you working with it rather than it dictating what you can do, are better than autonomous technology. There it is again, allowing the technology to really take on its own life and decide what you can do. To craft implies working at a personal scale, acting locally in reaction to anonymous, globalized industrial production. It's just a nice fleshing out of some of the things that Sennett has been saying. Actually, I'm not ready to go on there. Sennett also talks about how craft abilities draw on a depth of knowledge, skills that you can translate across platforms rather than being platform specific. So if you know how to edit, it's not just knowing how to edit in one kind of software, it's knowing principles of editing that translate across. If you know how to write, it's not just knowing how to write in WordPerfect, it's knowing how to write regardless of whether what platform you're using, whether you're starting with a legal pad or using a particular kind of word processing software. It's those translatable skills that cross the platforms.